In 1933, the Yankees debuted Russ Van Atta, left-handed pitcher of Augusta, New Jersey. I've never been there, but when Van Atta was a teen, his family moved about a 15-minute drive from where I am now. There were jobs there in those days in the zinc mining industry. I don't get there very often either, but sometimes when I'm casting about for a new place to have dinner, I think of this one restaurant that's there purely because they have a house-made pretzel on the appetizers menu. When it comes to restaurants, I'm not very interested in the entrees at all, just the bread. I know that that's a very unhealthy way of going about things, but as a great man once said, I am as God made me, sir. Van Atta, with zinc, sans house-made pretzels, was, in 1933, a 27-year-old rookie who had been toiling with the St. Paul Saints of the American Association for the previous 4 years after attending Penn State. His ERAs were spectacularly undistinguished, but in 1932, he went 22-17 and was getting written up as a prospect. The Yankees picked him up even though his ERA was .454 and he'd allowed more hits than he had innings pitched. In his rookie year, Van Atta went 12-4 with a save, retroactively figured, as we must always say in these instances, and was, with a little help from his park, about league average in allowing runs. It just goes to show that if you put a pitcher out there in a big stadium and ask Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig to hit a bunch of home runs in his support, he might just put up a misleading one-loss record. The guy led the league in winning percentage. This was a complete fluke. I should pause here and say that in telling a different story in a prior episode, and I'll mention the episode in a moment, that I told some aspects of the Russ Van Atta story before, but I want to get to a kind of different ending to it this time. I should also note, as I believe I did that previous time, that he had a really good first day to his major league career. This is what he's noted for, to the extent that he's noted at all. He made his major league debut against the Washington Senators at Griffith Stadium on April 25th, 1933. That Senators team would go on to play in the World Series, that is, win the American League pennant, but the Yankees just stomped them that day, with Van Atta going all the way on a 5-hit shutout. The offense backed him with 16 runs, and Van Atta himself was a big part of that, going 4 for 4 with an RBI and 3 runs scored. He was also credited with a sac bunt. The Yankees were up 6-0 at that point, and I'm a little surprised no one threw at him or started a fight, but actually, there was a fight, one that was still written about decades later. It had nothing to do with Van Atta. It started on a play at second when the always chippy Ben Chapman spiked Buddy Meyer, and it got worse from there. I talked about this fight in detail back in that prior episode, number 287, should you want to seek that out. I'll reshare this bit because I like it so much. When the fight started, Van Atta went running out of the dugout. "Come back here," Yankees manager Joe McCarthy shouted. "To hell with the ball game, here's a fight," Van Atta retorted and went to join the scrum. It was an auspicious debut, the bigot Chapman aside, but Van Atta wasn't that sort of pitcher, nor was he that kind of hitter, although he was decent by the standards of pitchers, averaging .228 in 206 lifetime at-bats. I gave a fuller biography of Van Atta back in that episode, including his relationship with the Babe, and I'm not going to recapitulate it here. I just want to note this, the conclusion of which I didn't talk about at that time. In December 1933, Van Atta's house in New Jersey burned down. He got his family out, but he realized the dog was still inside, and he heroically saved the dog, as I hope we would all want to do, even if we're always instructed not to do it in those cases. He had to punch out a window to go after it, though, and between cutting his hand on the glass and some burns, he permanently lost feeling in 2 fingers of his left hand, his pitching hand, which you would think would severely hamper him. Not every injury to one's hand turns you into 3-finger Brown. From then on, he was on and off the field due to that injury and other pitching injuries, more jejune ones like elbow pain, and he strived, mostly without success, to recapture that 1933 magic to the extent that he ever had it. He was kind of like the Democratic Party today, also trying to recapture that 1933 magic, except they'd never think of being that liberal or that successful. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Van Atta's ERA from 1934 through 1938 was 5.93. The Yankees sold him to the Browns in May 1935, which probably didn't help. He was then in a hitter's park with a weaker lineup and defense behind him, and his manager changed from the personable Joe McCarthy to the considerably less professional and generally rude and hostile Rogers Hornsby. The Browns generally used him as a swingman, but then they had seasons in which everyone was a swingman. Because of the dozen pitchers that they tried, none were actually good enough to claim a rotation spot. So they went through this kind of self-deceiving hokey pokey, which bad teams often do, where they'd try someone in the rotation, they'd bomb, and then they'd send them off to the bullpen, and they'd have a couple of good outings, and they'd say to themselves, lefty Von Hazmat really seems like he's turned a corner pitching in relief. And instead of concluding that, well, just leave him there then, especially in that era, they said, well, he must have figured out how to start then, and they'd throw him back in the rotation only to repeat the process all over again throughout an entire 154-game campaign. Later that season, in August of 1935, the San Francisco Chronicle headlined a story covering a game between, just coincidentally, the Yankees and the Browns. Yankees outdo Browns trying to lose game. Russ Van Atta blows. Surely something was cut off, though I'm not sure what. You'd think blows lead, but he didn't blow a lead. He blew a tie. He came into the game in the 13th inning with a man already on and allowed a single to Earl Coombs and a home run to Lou Gehrig. He wasn't even credited with the loss since the go-ahead run belonged to the prior pitcher. It was also, in fairness, worth noting that he had started and pitched 7 1/3 innings the day before, so give a guy a break before condemning him for blowing. Maybe they really meant it, but honestly, that would be shockingly frank even today. Russ Van Atta blows. Well, whether he did or he didn't, he stuck with the Browns despite consistently awful results because they had no one better going. As I said, he was used as a swingman, and it said something that he couldn't make the rotation on a team that bereft. It also says more that he twice led the league in appearances as a Brown, even though he was only marginally more effective when coming out of the pen. He had reverse splits. The better left-handed hitters of the time owned him. Senators Buddy Meyer and Joe Cool, both left-handed, hit over 400 against him in a substantial number of plate appearances, and once Van Atta was off the Yankees and Lou Gehrig got to see him from the batter's box, he too hit 400, knocking 3 home runs in only 17 at-bats. In September 1937, Van Atta went down with an elbow injury that required surgery, 1937 style. The Browns were skeptical that he would be able to contribute anything in 1938, maybe not at any other time, so they re-signed him to a $1 contract, plus some escalators if he did well. Well, he earned those escalators, though I guess that was just because he was able to show up. He started 12 times, put up a 5.54 ERA. That includes an attenuated shutout, a technical shutout. He was credited with a complete game shutout of the White Sox in a 5-inning game called for darkness. As for his relief work, remember when I said he was marginally more effective coming out of the bullpen? Not following elbow surgery, he wasn't. His relief ERA was 7.06. Well, Van Atta had to do something to save his career. Thus, on January 14th, 1939, the Associated Press reported, Russell Van Atta plans what he hopes will be a not too pleasant surprise for American League batters this coming baseball season. A screwball, similar to that of Carl Hubbell of the New York Giants. The St. Louis Browns pitcher, charter member of the group of hurlers plagued by sore arms, said he is in top condition again and forecast a successful season for himself. I began experimenting with the new delivery late last season, Van Atta explained. And if you remember, I won 4 of my last 5 starts with the Browns. The new screwball of mine is difficult to maneuver, but I have gotten it under control and will be able to mix it up with my other stuff. I'm in the best shape of my career. Yeah, he really said that. That's not a new thought, being in the best shape of one's career. Now, he was a better pitcher late in the 1938 season. At roughly the halfway point of the season, he was 0-5 with an ERA of about 8. After that, he dropped it all the way to just under 6, and his ERA in the starts he mentioned was 4.30, including that so-called shutout. It was something. On showing up at the Browns camp, Van Atta said, "I haven't thrown a ball all winter, so what the heck was he talking about the screwball? So all I can say is that my arm feels okay. I did work out a bit with the Yankees before I left, but all I did was jog around the field a few times." He actually liked to do a lot of running, but that wasn't going to do anything to rehab his arm or help him manage a tricky pitch like the screwball, which, by the way, is hard on the elbow, which is why a lot of pitchers don't throw it, even though, as we've seen, well, not quite in our own time at this point, but in many of our lifetimes, what Fernando Valenzuela could do with the pitch. And it was still sore. I mean, his arm, not the screwball. Although the screwball was probably sore also after batters laid wood on it a bunch of times. He only managed to pitch twice and got shelled both times. His old pals with the Yankees hit him up for 7 runs in a 4-inning relief appearance, although credit him with this. Manager Fred Haney, Rogers Hornsby, had been once again found too obnoxious to interact with other human beings and had been exiled on Elba or something. He brought in Van Atta with no outs and the bases loaded in the top of the first. The starter had failed that badly. 2 runs were already in, and Van Atta stranded all them runners, retiring George Selkirk, Joe Gordon, future Hall of Famer, and Babe Dahlgren in order, so he kept the game competitive. Now, it turned out that he would then load the bases himself multiple times in the ensuing innings, and the Yankees were less kind at that time. After that game, the Browns sold him down to the Toronto Maple Leafs of the International League, and his major league career was over. The truth is, no one is ever in the best shape of their lives, not even when they're born. It's a long toboggan ride downhill until you reach that point of stasis, a kind of perfection we call the infinite inning. Welcome back to the show. What show? Infinite Inning. What number? Number 372. Collect them, trade them, at least give each one a little bit of a taste to see if it suits you. Very low in calories, very low in sodium as well. We always watch that around here. We use other flavorings less likely to cause inflammation. Inflammation can be pretty bad for you, don't you know? Especially if you're on a time travel trip to the past on a mission to understand the present. The time machine being the game of baseball, but not thoroughly, not completely, not always, not entirely this episode, but mostly. And you are, of course, with your convivial host, Stephen Goldman. We care, we really do. We're number 2, so we try harder. Leave the driving to us. Or, and I read this in Mad Magazine approximately, for over 40 years ago now, there was the suggestion that this might be the most effective advertising slogan of all time, and I've never forgotten it. No one ever died from trying our brand. When I was in the 4th or 5th grade, maybe I was just a little bit early for this, I went through a period of being really obsessed with reading Mad Magazine. I got all the books that collected the old stuff that I could and picked up the magazine at the newsstand every month. And for some reason, that was really seen as a subversive act by a lot of the adults around me. I really took a lot of grief for it, and you'd think that the teachers, even my parents, were a little sort of iffy about it, though, and they were usually great about encouraging me to read, and you'd think that other people would have been like, hey, a kid who does read, who's not watching TV all day. And most of the humor was pretty safe, and it taught me some things. Not bad things, things about the history and the culture. They did a lot of song parodies, but of course it's a magazine. It doesn't have music in it. So they would write out the lyrics, and there'd be an asterisk at the top to be sung to the tune of Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. Do you think I knew my Rodgers and Hart tunes from the 1930s when I was 11? No, I had to figure that stuff out. I remember a parody of the TV series MASH, in which they pointed out that Alan Alda, who was writing a lot of his own stuff at that point for the show, couldn't figure out whether Hawkeye was meant to be Groucho Marx or Albert Schweitzer, which is still a great line. And I think I knew who Groucho Marx was broadly at that time, Groucho being such a big figure in the culture, and he had still been alive until relatively recently. And you saw people doing impressions on television constantly. I didn't know who Albert Schweitzer was then. And so what did I do? I looked up what I could, given the resources that were available at the time. I asked my folks some questions. What do they mean by this? And then other things you store away. And then later you might come across someone like Frank Sinatra or Ella Fitzgerald singing Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. And you say, oh, for some reason, what we read and when has just been on my mind a lot lately, if we read at all. Speaking of reading, this week at Baseball Prospectus, I had fun ranking long losing streaks. Yes, the New York Mets put that idea in my head. That losing streak of theirs is now in the past. But don't worry, they can start a new one at any time. I picked what felt like a representative top 10 in terms of long in-season losing streaks that had meaning more than just bad teams losing sequentially. You might disagree. There have been approximately, since 1901, 380 losing streaks of over 10 games. And I confess I did not go through all 380. Time would not permit. So it's very possible that if you dug in, you would find some others that were more suggestive to you of deeply rooted problems on the part of those teams or even of society. And I did find a few like that. That sounds pretentious and overblown when I say it out loud here, but it is absolutely true. And if you read it, you will, I promise, see what I mean about that. And if you know this show, if you know the kinds of things that we get into, then you can probably guess what it is that I'm getting at right here and now. Our big Patreon project, Dead Player of Day Series 2, the Countdown to 100, went on this week with another 4 players. I began with Bill Buckner, who could have been and probably has been a whole book. His mustache alone could have been an entire book. I just did the best that I could within the space available. Again, these are supposed to be quick and thought-provoking, not necessarily full-blown biographical essays or monographs, for gosh sakes. The random player generator then sent us from one guy who disappointed Red Sox fans to Don Budden, a shortstop who really disappointed them in a different way. He didn't disappoint them in that he messed up a World Series. He disappointed them in that he was not part of the solution to getting to a World Series. Then infielder Mike Mowry, third base glove man, was part of a freak play, which I have to thank Casey Stengel, master storyteller, for alerting me to once his name came up when I hit the random button. And finally, for the second week in a row, we ended with a Negro Leagues player. I was not super familiar with him, and that's to my shame because he was one of the top players of his time, Wild Bill Wright, a switch-hitting, power-hitting, very fast outfielder who really impressed everyone who saw him. Scared a few people, too. He was a big guy and occasionally temperamental. And to just give a hint as to the true meaning of his story, he's buried in Mexico. Now, why is that? Read it and you'll see. And speaking of reading it, it's been a while since anyone new has joined up. I would still like to get a couple more people in there. I suppose that's purely a selfish thing. But as I said last week, I write these things to be read. I share with you because I want to, because that gives me joy in life. And I still have a couple of copies of Baseball's Brief Lives, the Infinite Inning book, which greatly revised and expanded Dead Player of the Day Series 1. About half of those posts wound up in the book, and then there are a bunch that are in the book that weren't part of Series 1. I wrote them specifically for the book and the book alone. So if you haven't read the book, you haven't seen those particular player posts or player comments or player short biographies, whatever you want to call it. I'm flexible. I bring this up because, ideally, I will give a signed copy of said book to the first person who signs up at the $5 a month or higher, we can always hope, level. I make that stipulation not out of avarice, but because at a lower level, the reality of the costs are that I won't even break even. That's how sad this whole business is. And if you like, you could pick instead a copy of Forging Genius, my Casey Stengel biography, now sadly out of print. Hoovered up by one of the AI companies, yes. In stores, no. That is my pitch to you because I am desirous of more of your company. And that need for your attendance, your participation extends to the next segment of the show, at which we will arrive directly after this incoming break. I want to talk a bit about the first of the great Yankees owners, really the only one, and his main insight was, what if we run this thing kind of professionally? How would that work? And I want to talk about a key decision that he made, maybe the most important decision that he made subsequent to professionalizing the club. I guess there were 5. I'm going to be a lot like the Spanish Inquisition sketch in Monty Python here, because I can keep thinking of more. But it was to initially buy the club, to pick precisely the right guy to run it in Edward Grant Barrow, lifting him from the Red Sox. Then there was his decision to shell out the cash to pick up Babe Ruth, to buy out his partner who was standing between him and running it professionally. And then, in 1932, this decision that I want to talk about now, yes, I am referring to the Colonel, Jacob Rupert, and I want to talk about that decision that he made in the context of the casus belli for the war that the United States is in right now. I know that sounds like an odd juxtaposition, but I think it all comes together. You'll have to be the one to decide that, and you'll get your first crack at it right after this brief intermission. I'm currently reading a book that came out late last year called The Most Awful Responsibility: Truman and the Secret Struggle for Control of the Atomic Age, the Anti-Nuclear President, the Bomb Decision, and Cold War History by Alex Wellerstein, a professor at Stevens here in New Jersey. The book pursues a number of threads about the decision to use the atomic bomb on Japan, which wasn't so much a decision as kind of a stone rolling downhill and no one got in the way of it, and then the aftermath. Quite literally, now what? We have this incredibly dangerous weapon. We have let the demon out of the bottle. Someone was going to, so that wasn't the issue. In fact, that someone was going to, and that someone was probably going to be the Germans, was the entire reason Franklin Roosevelt blessed the Manhattan Project, a more or less off-the-books crash project to get there before the most evil people that history had coughed up to that point got there. Hork, 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 said history like a cat with a hairball, and, well, you know what happened next. But okay, nuclear weapons had been invented, they'd been used, we've seen the results, and well, they're upsetting. We knew they would be, but we still had to see it first to get the full impact. Many key people involved with the development of the bomb, whether on the scientific side or on the political side, understood pretty much from day one that proliferation was going to be the big issue from then on, because there was nothing secret about the way atomic fission worked. That was just science. It had been discussed for a long time. Now, getting from that knowledge to a workable bomb was the complicated part, and it still is, even today. But we knew that some, or perhaps many countries, beginning with the USSR, were likely to figure it out. So how do you manage things, manage the world, which is right off the bat kind of an impossible concept to grapple with, so that the rest of human existence for all of time is not governed by an arms race that ultimately predicates the continuance of the human race on the concept of mutually assured destruction? Do we say, in 1945, 1946, you know what, this technology, it's bad, forget it. We'll forego it if everyone else forgoes it. And then do we trust that they really did that? Will they believe us, even if we do make that offer? Will anyone even take us up on it? The reason that I wanted to read this book now is that what we're going through with Iran today is a continuation of the same discussion. That argument was never resolved, for the obvious reason that the questions have no answers. Not good or reliable ones, anyway. The question of how to survive in a world in which weapons of mass annihilation and indeed extinction exist. And particularly at that time, there were no good answers, in part because the player on the other side of the table was Joseph Stalin, who was just not going to opt to say, yes, peace and brotherhood, we will trust, we will beat our fissile material into plowshares, kisses on both cheeks. Whether you read one of the many books on the Cold War, of which this is one, or studied this stuff in college like I didn't major in baseball, try to think through the problem and figure out a better solution than what we've lived with or under for the past 86 years. I don't know that you can. The best that we can do is MAD, mutually assured destruction, especially now that the computers will survive us and do the retaliation for us, right? If you launch a first strike, the second strike is going to get you. This kind of thinking, by the way, led to arguments in the 60s and 70s about throw weight. That is, not only do we have to have enough bombs to destroy the other guy, but we need so many more than that, because when he strikes us first, when he does his nuclear Pearl Harbor thing, he's going to target a lot of our missile sites. So we need to have a bunch left over so that he can know that he's going to be punished very badly for murdering all of us. Therefore, it is better not to start. Kisses on both cheeks. Everybody either ends up a shadow on the wall, like in that Statler Brothers song, or succumbing slowly and painfully, or quickly and painfully, to radioactive fire. No advantage to be gained there, so just don't. But I think even more than that, more importantly, the stigma that we've placed on using these weapons since 1945 has kept them from being used, even as the concept of battlefield nukes, suitcase nukes, has evolved. Something you could theoretically keep contained and not destroy whole cities, but just legit military targets. The first actor since 1945 who breaks that taboo will have done the human race a massive disservice. The one flaw, even with the widespread understanding that this is something you just don't do, is crazy people. The problem with innovation, as this shows, is that one's monopoly is fleeting. Think of some radical advancements in baseball. Branch Rickey began developing the first farm system in the late 1920s so that the St. Louis Cardinals could compete more effectively with the New York teams. He could sign the players cheaply before they had proven themselves, control their progress up the ladder, including how they were coached so that they would arrive more prepared, and then bring them up when they were ready or trade the excess. He didn't have to go to, say, a Pacific Coast League team and pay them six figures for kids that he couldn't even be sure would work out. In August 1927, Ed Barrow, who I mentioned earlier, general manager of the Yankees, paid the Oakland Oaks $125,000 in, again, 1927 money, Coolidge dollars, for their double play combination of Jimmy Reese and Lynn Larry. Both players were such disappointments, at least in Barrow's eyes, that in his memoirs, he said he was ashamed of the deal. That didn't keep Barrow from staying in office nearly another 20 years, whereas Rickey couldn't afford to make that large of a mistake, not from a budgetary point of view, and not if he wanted to remain employed. And so he set up his system to control costs so he didn't have to risk that. But Rickey couldn't patent vertical integration, which was only a new idea in baseball, not the world. So what happened when other teams saw how well he was doing with the farm system? What stopped them from doing the exact same thing? Well, he was safe from some of them because they were either controlled by old guys who were incapable of learning a new trick, or disagreed on sort of a moralistic level about the way chain store baseball degraded the minors, or they were too broke to do much either way. Or maybe all of the above. The Yankees, though, they weren't in that category. When their owner, beer baron Jacob Ruppert, also a New York politician, went to Barrow and said, "I like what Rickey is doing. Should we jump on that?" Barrow said no. He was in that category of guys who were a little hidebound. Rickey was only going to all that trouble because he had no money, Barrow said, so what's the point? You can see it, right? Right now, all these years later, you can see why he should have said yes, okay? Well, Ruppert could see it too, so he had to think about it, and he decided to do it anyway. He bought the Newark Bears of the International League and brought in George Weiss, then operating the independent New Haven Eastern League Club, to add even more teams. I've thought about this a lot. The day that Ruppert overruled the guy who ran the team, who had run it very well, who had been in baseball basically forever, and had probably had a state-of-the-art understanding of how to run a team exactly up to that moment. Now, it's not like Ruppert left an extensive record of who he was as a person, but he wasn't necessarily known as a genius. He was just a businessman. Maybe that was enough. And I've wondered how he came to that insight and what it might have been in his life that made him open to doing this thing, which again, not every team had jumped on to that point, and that some were in fact opposed to. And what I think maybe is that he was in a position, especially at that moment, but later too, where he had a greater appreciation for the value of a buck than you would have expected, given that he was supposed to be spectacularly wealthy. So, fascinating thing about Jacob Ruppert. He was a beer manufacturer, actually the heir to a beer manufacturer, who worked his way up from the bottom in the family business, then took it over when the old man died. But he had to make it through a dozen years of prohibition. He sold near beer at that time. And, overlapping with that, the Great Depression, which meant people were spending less money, even on near beer. He had a bevy of mistresses and a string of horses. Or maybe that's a bevy of horses and a string of mistresses. The country's biggest kennel of St. Bernards. Those St. Bernards consume $5 grand in meat a year. Again, in 1920s money. He had a staff of 40 at his estate and a private zoo. He also collected English portraits, Barbizon landscapes, animal bronzes by the 19th century French artist Pierre-Jules Maine and Antoine-Louis Barye, Chinese porcelains of the Ming and Qing dynasties, which the 1930s papers actually referred to as the Kangxi dynasty, and I was confused because I thought that was a Marvel comic. Elizabethan furniture and 16th century tapestries, Native American relics, I'm not sure what that means, it could mean something kind of dark, something dehumanizing, and so much more. What I am trying to convey is that the man was rather a profligate spender and was keeping up his collecting at a time when he was not making big beer money, but whatever you could bring in on non-alcoholic beverages during the biggest economic crisis of all time. And it got worse for him because when Prohibition was voted in, he had to write off mortgages that he held on a bunch of saloons. I'm guessing he held the notes as collateral for beer sales on credit. He had to sell his rare books collection to make up for that, but he did keep the jades and the Chinese porcelain and all the rest. In 1933, he also helped finance Admiral Richard E. Byrd's second expedition to Antarctica. I think he went with, not all the way to the Penguins maybe, but he was on the ship south. He also had an active social life, and we'll get back to that in a second. It relates to the bevy of mistresses, which might not have been truly a bevy. How many is a bevy? I don't know, more than 2? Even though the Yankees were the most successful team in baseball, there were no regional sports networks at that time, barely radio, so he was making money, but it was primarily what he could get out of the turnstiles. Prohibition ended in December 1933, so he was able to go back to making some real money from his beer. And yet, when Ruppert died in 1939, the estate was initially reported to be worth something like $40 million or $100 million. But by the time various debts and taxes were figured in, there wasn't very much left. It probably still would have been a lot to the average person back then, and even a lot to many of us now, but it wasn't what people expected. By the time the executors sorted through everything, they were down to a valuation of about $6 million. 2/3 of that was his stock in Jacob Ruppert Incorporated, which owned the Yankees in Yankee Stadium. And that turned out to be an overestimate because the Yankees didn't sell for $4 million. Dan Topping, Del Webb, and Larry MacPhail in 1945 paid all of $2.8 million for the club. When Ruppert died, the New York Herald Tribune wrote, his Yankees, bought for $450,000, transformed into a $10 million unit. They just made that number up out of thin air. I'm not saying that Ruppert wasn't truly wealthy. He might have been worth something like $100 million in present day money. That's a lot of scratch. It's just that, A, almost none of it was liquid. He died with $75,000 in the bank. When you get down to the true value of the estate being maybe $4 or $6 million, everyone figured he was worth at least 10 times that much. Now, as a bit of a sidebar to this, let me note that his will was a shocker to everyone involved, very much including the Yankees. Ruppert never married. Even when he was in his old age, the newspapers would refer to him As one of New York's most eligible bachelors, and why not? It wouldn't have mattered if he were 100. He supposedly had the money. That's what made him attractive. He certainly thought he had the money. With no wife or kids to endow, he left the bulk of his estate, including the Yankees, to 3 women. 2 of them were his married nieces, Helen and Rita. As for the third, she was very much not his niece. Or was she? Well, I'll tell you who she was. It's time for a break. Okay, hang in there, please, for this second and I believe last intermission of the episode. And on the other side, we will get to Jacob Rupert's secret heiress. The heretofore unsuspected new third owner of the New York Yankees was a 37-year-old former actress from Massachusetts named Helen Winthrop Wayant. Performing under the name Winthrop Wayne, she had been in at least 5 Broadway shows from 1922 through 1929, including Our Nell, with some early music by George Gershwin, Sitting Pretty, with songs by Jerome Kern and P.G. Wodehouse, The Grab Bag, a review in which seemingly everything was written by the comic actor Ed Wynn. Ever see Mary Poppins? He gets his own scene in that. A Straight Play, Saturday Night, written by Spanish Nobel Prize winner Jacinto Benavente, and directed by and starring the then famous Broadway actress Eve Le Gallienne, and Three Cheers, with a couple of songs interpolated by the famed songwriting team of De Silva, Brown, and Henderson. The Best Things in Life Are Free guys, among many others. Will Rogers was in that. She generally had small parts, chorus parts, and perhaps that's why she gave it up as a bad job. Who the hell are you? The papers politely asked when they showed up at the unpretentious apartment she shared with her mother and brother. She described herself as a very old friend, or said that Rupert was a very old friend of her father, who was no longer around to talk about it. She said that when he entertained at his estate in Garrison, New York, the Eagles Rest, she acted as his hostess. Some papers described her as his ward, and said she met Rupert when she was a girl of 13 in Springfield, Massachusetts, which, yes, could be and probably was innocent. Ward suggests a legal arrangement, however, which doesn't seem to have existed. She was from Springfield, and maybe her dad had a brickyard up there which abutted some property of Rupert's. It's a little vague. She took another run at defining it and failed. I couldn't say just what you would call our relationship outside of friendship. Would you call it sort of a father and daughter relationship, she was asked. I never asked him. Or maybe she said, yes, I believe you could call it that. Both answers were reported. And she added, I was very fond of Colonel Rupert. She said he never gave me an inkling that I was mentioned in his will. I hope I can do good with the money, she said of the bequest. But I certainly have no interest in going back on the stage. I don't know what I shall do in the near future. She also said she was fond of animals, and suggested it was a common liking of animals which accounted for the friendship between her and Colonel Rupert. Had she been married at any time? No, I'm single and I have no interest in any man. When her brother died in 1981, she was still living under her maiden name, Helen Wayant, in Scarsdale, New York, on a, quote, estate. She would have been about 79 then. I lose track of her after that. Her brother, Rex Wayant, was an assistant road secretary for the Yankees at the time of the colonel's death, eventually rising to the level of full-on road secretary, or traveling secretary, we would say today. He left in 1945 when MacPhail bought the team. He was a former high school and college first baseman, so I guess he knew his way around a clubhouse. Helen didn't give too many interviews, just a few around when she was named in the will, and then pretty much none at all, if not pretty much, just period, as far as I can tell. None at all. She came off well. One paper called her a gracious, cultured woman. She said, I like simple things. I'm very easily pleased, and I've always been very thrifty. No, I've never been broke. I suppose my life will change a little now, but I'm not going to change my mode of living. I'm going on in the same way. However, I'd like to give to charity. I think everybody should if they can. She said that she'd like to play golf and tennis. She liked football and baseball. I've always been for the Yanks. I think it is a grand team. I'll go to see them play as often as I can. It was reported that she went to many games, but never in the company of Colonel Rupert. She was photographed with him on other occasions, but she didn't want to show up in a box seat with him. That would have, I guess, drawn too much attention. A man named George W. Sutton Jr., who handled publicity for the Colonel, said that his interest in Miss Weyant could be explained in one Spanish word: simpatico, understanding. He is a simple man and direct, but he had moments of loneliness. Sometimes when he was busy, he would stop and ask me about my farm and talk like that until something turned him back into the business machine he was. Miss Weyant had a perfect understanding of his simple interests: art, gardening, animals. Simpatico. A kiss on both cheeks. Relatives declared Miss Weyant always was the bachelor-type girl, vivacious, good-natured, but never apparently interested in marriage, wrote the Boston American. Friends and relatives alike never can remember her having a real sweetheart. Her friends were many, but none, they stated, could really be placed in the sweetheart class. Rupert's niece, or one of them, Mrs. Helen Holleran, said, "Miss Weyant is a perfectly charming girl, extremely smart-looking and very well-informed. She talks interestingly about any subject that comes up. I met her a number of times at Uncle Jake's place in Garrison, where he entertained his friends. I liked her, and I know she was my uncle's friend and brought happiness into his life. If he wanted to leave her part of his money, I'm glad." Gossip columnist Walter Winchell reported that Helen Winthrop Weyant, the actress who inherited all that Colonel Rupert coin, wasn't his sweetie pie, according to intimates. My guess, and it's as good as anyone's at this late date, they were both closeted, and they really were just friends, but I have no evidence of that or of anything else. Rupert bequeathed Helen Weyant $300,000 in cash, free and clear. The estate would pay the taxes on it, so she got the raw total. As I've already said, the estate didn't have that in cash. He also left her a 1/3 interest in the Yankees, the brewery, and everything else via a couple of trusts. Together, she and the two nieces held 86.88% of the Yankees. By the by, he also left $150,000 to the Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan, of which he was a trustee, but same deal, no cash. The three women pressed for the Yankees to be sold. They had no say in the running of it or the disposing of it. "Gracious, I wouldn't know anything about running a ball club," Helen Holleran said. "I'll leave all that to the trustees." Helen Weyant said something similar. But their getting paid was tied up in the club being cashed out. When it finally happened, they split $2.5 million. If you're curious, team president Ed Barrow had 10% and got about $300,000 out of the sale. Rupert's brother George had 3.12%, and he did not sell at that time. I think Helen Weyant was still trying to get her cash out years later, because you can find records of her participating as a seller in art auctions, her name right next to that of the Rupert estate, which was also selling pieces. When reporters asked her what she would do with the money, one of the other things she said was, "I've always wanted to travel and collect pictures. Now I will be able to do it." She didn't say anything about selling Elizabethan furniture, and yet that's what you find her doing. My guess is she took some of Rupert's collection in lieu of the cash that he didn't have. His will had given the Metropolitan Museum of Art first pick of his collection, but museums have to be discerning, since once they take something by law, it's very difficult for them to get rid of it. They chose only 65 pieces, 9 paintings, 20 bronzes, including 10 by Frederick Remington and 4 by Augustus St. Gaudens, 28 pieces of what was then called Far Eastern art, and then it seems likely that the estate divvied up whatever was left. And by the way, if you want to see what they chose, you can go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art website and search on Bequest of Jacob Rupert. A lot of stuff that's not part of the bequest will come up later in the search, but right at the top they have pictures of most of it. There are a few items that are not pictured, I suspect because they went into storage in 1939 and haven't been out since, which is the fate of a lot of museum holdings. They are always acquisitive despite limited space, but you can see some of it in person as well, such as a really amazing late 18th or early 19th century jade carving of a landscape, complete with trees, a rushing river, and a waiting crane. It is just incredible to me that someone can take a rock and turn it into something so beautiful. Not that some rocks aren't beautiful to start with. I bring up all of the foregoing because it might help explain why. When Rupert went to Barrow with the farm system idea in 1932, and Barrow said no, Rupert overruled him and said yes. It was expensive up front, but it would have made player acquisition costs cheaper in the long term, which would have meant that Rupert could have pulled more money out of the team. That brings us back to Branch Rickey and atomic bombs. When Rupert died, the Yankees owned multiple farm teams, yet when there was a chance for them to go outside of the system and spend the players and cash that the San Francisco Seals required to give them a top prospect like Joe DiMaggio, they did that too. And that was more than Rickey could do. As we discussed last week, the same limitations applied to Rickey's breaking of the color line. He got first picks of the players in the Negro Leagues, but not all the picks. He knew that he shouldn't have them all either, but that's not normally how businesses function. But he was forced to consider not just the innovation itself, but how the innovation would affect him and others, and what would happen once the innovation spread to the rest of baseball. In the 1940s, the American government was struggling with a similar issue, although whereas no matter how Branch Rickey or the Dodgers directly benefited, more broadly speaking, the issue was going to have a benevolent outcome, while the United States government had essentially helped create a means of murdering every man, woman, child, and kitty cat on the planet, and then had to figure out what to do about it. As we discussed earlier, some of our leaders were keen to just wipe it off the world stage, prevent others from getting it, and hopefully never look at it again ourselves. Others were kind of keen to use it or at least exploit it for political and diplomatic gain. In terms of using it, some military minds, and this may yet be true today, were slow to comprehend that nuclear weapons are not indeed weapons. They are misnamed. You use weapons to win a battle, and you fight the battle because in some way it benefits your cause. But the destruction wrought by those weapons is so thorough, so complete, that they can't really be used to blow up an enemy army. They blow up cities, and cities are full of civilians. And so automatically the use is an atrocity. And I would argue that putting aside that definitionally an atrocity is a moral crime, that there has yet to be a nation that got closer to the goal that it was pursuing by means of an atrocity. And certainly no nation was ever ennobled by one. As for using it as a point of leverage in discussions with other nations, it only has so much utility there as well. Early in the post-war period, there was a famous exchange between Secretary of State Jimmy Burns, who was in office for about 2.5 years beginning in July 1945, and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. I don't recall this perfectly. I'm doing this from ancient memory, so please correct me if you happen to look it up yourself. But the exchange went something like this. Molotov said roughly, "You Americans are always trying to push us around because you have the bomb and you're the only ones who have the bomb. You act like you're a cowboy with a bomb on your hip. Do you have one on your hip right now, do you?" Burns replied, "That's right, and if you don't quit stalling and start negotiating, I'm going to pull an atomic bomb out of my pocket and let you have it." Supposedly everyone laughed, but I'm guessing exchanges like that did not ease tensions during the nascent years of the Cold War. A little earlier, then Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson observed to the president, that was Truman at the time, that being ahead in an arms race wasn't nearly as much of an advantage as not having an arms race at all. Well, we got one anyway, because there was no way out of it. As I said earlier, part of the problem was Joseph Stalin, who was too paranoid to pursue a different path, which in this episode we have nicknamed the kiss on both cheeks policy. But I'm not sure that any leader would have. You would have had to have trust that the United States would disarm itself and stop pursuing bigger and better nuclear bombs, for which there was a huge lobby at the time, and you would have had to trust that we'd never elect anyone so unstable as to use the advantage that being the sole possessor of nuclear weapons would have provided to blackmail the rest of the world. So the Manhattan Project was very much an evolutionary dead end that probably triggered the extinction of the human race, but only very, very slowly. The current conflict with Iran is rooted in our still being fearful of what happens when the wrong people get the bomb, but the wrong people have it already. That is, everyone who has it. 87 years later, the question of why Colonel Rupert jumped into the farm system and whether it had a connection with his secret relationship with a lady named Helen remains unanswered. 81 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so too does the question of what do we do about the bomb. Friends, midway through the production of this episode, the computer ate the dang thing and I had to reconstruct it from scraps. If you find any errors, I apologize. It was the best that I could do, short of not having an episode this week. If you'd like to have an episode with me on social media, please follow me at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. There remains a Facebook group, and this week I put up pictures of Helen Wyant and some other associated images. Simply go to Facebook and you know the rest. As we discussed earlier, should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please go to patreon.com/theinfiniteinning and sign up, and I will take requests on Dead Player of the Day posts. That goes for newbies and longtime subscribers. I take no one for granted. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe, please. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. Sometimes you just have to ask to talk to the manager, even though we frown on those things these days. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, you know why we've been together all these years? It's one word, simpatico. Well, if I can just get out of here before another act of revenge by R2-D2, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.